Daniel 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any facial defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen, some from Judah, were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, and to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. Now, God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, "I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other men of your age? The king would then have my head because of you." Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearances with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see." So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them and found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in the whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the 1st year of King Cyrus. This is the word of the Lord.
Good evening, all. Good evening. Does everyone, can you hear me? Yeah, good. My name's Rich, if I haven't met you before, and I'm one of the ministers here, and it's a new term, isn't it? It's quite exciting, for some, maybe nerve-wracking. So some people going to a new school or starting a new school year, new PM tomorrow. It's really exciting. No? Okay. It's a new term anyway. And Daniel 1 is a really good chapter for thinking about a new term. Back in July, the staff team went away for a couple of days for a bit of a retreat, and we had a chap called Viv Thomas come to speak to us, and he was speaking to us about second choice lives and how to embrace second choice life. And what he means by that is that things in life don't always turn out as you hope they might, and how we embrace the reality of that. So I listen to all kinds of podcasts, and often on podcasts, when people are being interviewed, comedians or politicians or whatever, they're asked, what did you want to be when you grow up? And quite often they're doing what they wanted to do, but I wonder if I asked you kind of what you're thinking, what you wanted to be when you grow up, or youth, what you're thinking, this is what I want to be when I grow up. And have you got there? Is that where you are now? I kind of wanted to be a policeman, which sounds a bit odd, but weirdly, my dad had been a policeman for 2 years, and I think maybe that was the thing. One of my daughters wants to be a detective or a spy, so clearly it's sort of a passed on thing, but we don't last long in it. So my other daughter is quite keen on the idea of earning a lot of money, having a big house with a swimming pool, and I'm hoping she'll find room for a granddad annex somewhere for me, so I've got somewhere to do my hydrotherapy when I'm old. Anyway, that's my plan. But life doesn't always work out as we hope it might. And that's sometimes to do with us, so to do with our own mistakes and mess-ups and the things that we get wrong. Sometimes it's to do with just circumstances, other people, and the second choice world that we're part of as well. That often things stand against us and it doesn't quite go how we'd hope. I'm just going to read out a little quote from the beginning of the book. Viv says, "We often find ourselves in lonely cities doing soulless jobs and living with painful family relationships, which look so promising in the initial stages, but have now become damaged or dangerous. We often have to live in places which are not home, with relationships we don't really want, and are expected to do it all with skill, wit, and wisdom. Our reality is that we're not adequate for the task. We do not possess the resources to do this well." And his book is about this dilemma. And Daniel is about this dilemma as well, because when we meet Daniel in this book, he's been thrown into a second choice life. So the Babylonian kingdom was one of the most violent kingdoms we've ever seen on the planet. And they had invaded Israel, taken over, decimated the people, and taken people into exile. And Daniel and his friends were in this situation where, they didn't have really many choices. He was forced to work in the king's palace, to study there. He had to learn the language. He had to follow the culture and the customs of this horrendous place. And he didn't want these people for his friends. He didn't want to eat the same food and so on. And yet he was forced into this situation. He was in a second choice life. And it's so interesting, isn't it, to see how he manages to embrace it. And he does it with a lot of skill, wit, and wisdom, as Viv Thomas talks about. So we've got these young guys, they're young, handsome, very intelligent. I mean, they probably remind you of someone. Okay, maybe not. Maybe some of the youth who are intelligent and young. But anyway, so these guys are navigating this actually quite a terrifying kingly court. You can see by the way Ashpenaz responds to the suggestion of changing the food. He goes into a panic because this king, if he gets it wrong, he's having his head literally. And that's one of the interesting things when you look at ancient governments. It's violent, it's uncertain, and anything that could challenge that sends people into a nervous panic. But it's interesting because Daniel, he absorbs the culture and adjusts to the culture in some things, but not in everything. And it's a real good tip to us to think, are we wise and are we thinking about how we walk through the culture that we live in? There are certain things that are beyond our control and other things that maybe we can change and influence, but maybe it's just about how we live through those things and the character we have through those things and how we embrace them that are at issue. And I just kind of find it so interesting how Daniel decides that he will accept this new name, Belteshazzar, which actually would have been kind of really obnoxious to him because it was a name associated with the cultic practices of pagan worship. So he accepts that and yet decides to draw a line in the sand over the food. But the way he draws a line in the sand over the food is really clever, isn't it? He compromises and negotiates with Ashpenaz and says, well, give it 10 days, let's see how it goes. It's clever. It's not just kind of resisting with thoughtlessness. It's careful and considered. Have a look at verse 8. Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. And then they go through this test, and it works. And they're able to live without having food sacrificed to idols. And it's a really wise way of going about it. And actually, this is quite a familiar world to us, isn't it? Many people in their workplaces have to think about, how will I get through today not lying, but also keeping my job? Or thinking about the people you sit next to at work who you might find really obnoxious and it's really difficult to work with them, but you still have to work with them tomorrow. So how am I going to negotiate this difficult relationship on an ongoing basis? Or it could be tricky things with a neighbor. There's all sorts of complex choices that we face as we live out our Christian lives. And as I've been thinking this week, I've looked back on my own life and thought, there were some times where I think I drew the line in the sand too early, if you like. So at university, for example, I decided to go teetotal because I just thought it would be easier. And in some ways, it really was, because I could help my friends home after a heavy night at the club or whatever. And that was actually a good thing to be able to offer my friends. It also meant I was in control of myself and didn't make tons of crazy mistakes. But at the same time, I think some of my relationships weren't as good as they could have been because I wasn't just chilled at times. And I think I came across as a bit too strange to relate to. But we have these things to navigate, don't we? But it's interesting because with my girls, we have regular conversations about what we do with alcohol. And, they see that I am really interested in beer and breweries, and they sort of joke with me a lot about, I tend to reference most of my holidays to what pub I went to, but it's in moderation. And so I never had those conversations with my parents. I didn't have the model. But it's so important, isn't it, to have chats with each other. And so we see Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're in relationship. They're dependent on each other. They are, all of them, in the world, but not of the world, and working out how we navigate being Christians in a world that doesn't have all the same values. We actually need to do that together, don't we? As well as with the Bible and exploring and questioning. But it is one of those things where it's pressing into a purposeful life where we're thinking, how do I navigate a second choice world by making first choices for God, if you like. I'm just going to quote Steve's prayer before the service as a really good thought. Actually making first choices for God in our second choice world. And I think sometimes we can freeze a bit, can't we, when we feel like a lot of things are out of our control and we can't change certain things. But then I think lots of things are in our control in terms of how we respond. What am I going to be like on my first day of school? And will I mention that I go to church? And how do I navigate that I am a Christian, but I don't also want to put people off? I would just want to be a normal person around people as well. And that's a really valuable thing to do. Now, I do want to mention James just for a moment, because James is with us for the last Sunday, and we've loved having him working here. He's worked with me for nearly 5 years up at Croydon and done amazing things there. And actually, I've noticed with him how he's sort of navigated this second choice world, but putting Jesus at the center. When James arrived, some people will know this, be aware of this more than others, but when he arrived, about a week later, he had to go straight back to South Africa because his sister had been killed in a hit-and-run accident. And, you know, just absolutely world-shaking event. And yet, James and his whole family, to be honest, just faced that with such an incredible amount of faith, turning to Jesus, still able to not be completely self-absorbed and everything, like so others-focused. It's remarkable. And so when things hit us, whether it's tragedy or just things not the second choice world we're part of, we have the choice, don't we, to still say, I'll follow Jesus, I'll put him first, and I'll still try and pursue the character of God. And then, you know, when the pandemic hit, which hit us in all different ways, you know, James and Alison had to sort of have dates on the common in the rain. And, you know, actually he was very isolated in his flat, but again, he still had this, you know, equanimity, I don't know if that's the right word, but, you know, he just was so always all in. How can I serve? How can I put others first? How can I reach out to those around me on the estate? And it's just amazing. Anyway, I just think it's worth talking about examples around us of how they do it. And James, we are going to miss you, and you have invested well in this place, so well done. Paul, who wrote lots of the New Testament, wrote in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 1, follow me as I follow Christ. And it can sound really big-headed, can't it? Or, I'm a really great Christian, so follow me, I'm following Christ. But actually, when you think about it, those believers probably had little scraps of the Bible. They probably had barely anything to go on. They'd heard about Jesus, they'd heard the good news, they'd heard a few sermons from apostles, but actually, what do you have to go on? You have to go on examples. How are people around you going to come to Jesus? You need to tell them. And then how are they going to start following you? They want to see your life and how you live in second choice lives, but putting Jesus first. And I kind of love that as an absolute inspiration for how we begin this term. We think we're the example for people to find out what it means to follow Christ. I've been reading through John's Gospel over the last few months. And one of the cool things in John's Gospel is in John 17, Jesus is praying for us. And we see that Jesus, on an ongoing basis, is praying for us. He says this in John 17, verse 14. I have given them your word, and the world has hated them, for they are not of the world any more than I am of the world. My prayer is not that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. They are not of the world, even as I am not of it. Sanctify them by the truth. Your word is truth. And you sent me into the as you sent me into the world, I have sent them into the world. So Jesus knows that it is not going to be easy for the disciples to be sent out into this second choice world. So he leaves his Spirit to fill the disciples, to give them wisdom, to help them navigate the world. He gives us examples like Jesus, like Daniel to follow. And he prays that we would discern where we need to be distinctive and where we know where we're to be sent into the world. So I'd just love you to just, in a moment of quiet, just think, where do I need to be distinctive in my Christian walk as I go through this second choice world? What do I need to resolve to do differently? And perhaps maybe where do you just need to spend time trying to understand your culture a bit more and discern what it might mean to stand out as a Christian? I would encourage you to kind of go into this more. Chat to people in cell group when you meet in your year groups or in your home groups. Like, chat to Christian friends and say, what would you do in this situation? Like, thrash it out, because I think we need to help each other in this. I wouldn't want you to be where I know I've been in the past, thinking, I didn't quite get it right, and I'd love to follow Jesus better. So let's just have a moment of quiet. Lord, would you fill this moment with your voice in our hearts, that we might discern where you're saying we need to resolve to be distinctive, to be wise about how we walk through this life. That you would help us to know where we can make changes around us or changes within us about how we respond to things. So fill this moment now with your voice. Lord Jesus, we resolve at the beginning of this term to make you our first choice as we navigate through this world. In Jesus' name, amen.